Welcome, Peter, Cameron, to Lucy. Thank you very much for being with us. I would like to start our conversation by speaking about your last collection of stories, which has just been published by Adelphi, and with a wonderful translation of Giuseppina Oneto. Che cosa fa la gente tutto il giorno? It's a collection of 12 stories with a lot of different characters. We follow the most diverse characters by age, gender, and social class. So we have all this huge spectrum of different characters that find themselves, maybe all of them, in a situation on the verge of something that changes. And what I wanted to ask you is something related to your way of building up stories and characters, because you always said that you never pick up stories from real life or not even autobiographical stuff. And so where are these characters coming from? Where are your stories coming from?
Right. I think it's interesting to me because I don't write about my own life, and my characters are not based on people I know. And I think very early on in my career, when I was writing so many stories, I remember the first story that I wrote that was in the voice, the narrator was female, so I was crossing this gender line, and I showed it to the New Yorker, and they were like, "Oh, we're not sure you should do this," or, "This is a tricky, dangerous thing to do." And my reasoning or my thinking was that there's so many things that differentiate us from each other, and I feel like gender is one of them, but economics, and all these things, sexuality and temperament. And so I just felt like if I'm not going to write about myself, I should feel free to write about anybody else. Like I didn't want to be restrained by certain parameters. And so then I felt, I was free to write about women, about older people, about younger people. And the characters then, when you open yourself up to that, they just, I think all my characters come to me through my subconscious, and they're not characters, as I said, that I know or that I purposefully imagine. They're just, suddenly I find I'm thinking about these people, and a lot of my writing happens in my head. I spend a lot of time thinking about the characters in the story before I start writing it. So it's all very much a very internal, very initially at least subconscious process.
I wanted to stick to this subject of the freedom of speaking, of telling the stories of your characters that have lived lives different from yours. And by living in the United States in recent years, I have felt that this freedom has been in some way endangered by the problem of cultural appropriation that became huge. And so I wanted to ask if you have the feeling that something has changed in recent years, and that you have ever felt yourself that you had boundaries that you didn't want to cross.
I think you're right, because I feel like the culture has changed in the United States, and there's been a lot of concern by people about cultural appropriation. And I, in the same way that I gave myself that freedom so long ago, I sort of want to retain that freedom. I don't understand. I think I feel fiction should be free. That fiction it's about liberty. It's about imagination. It's about, both in terms of reading novels and writing novels, it's about getting out of your own life and experiencing other lives. And I feel like the criteria for whether a novel is good or not is not really the content, but if it's a good novel, if it moves us, if it seems true to us, if the experience and the characters seem genuine. And so therefore, I feel like this idea that you should only write about your own experiences, to me, it seems like a form of censorship, and it's a way of limiting writers, where I don't see the point of that, and I think it hurts us all in the end, because it narrows the universe of what fiction can be.
To some extent, we can say that cultural appropriation is the point of writing fiction.
Exactly. Yes, I totally agree, and I think it's that instinct to tell people they shouldn't be doing that is so anti-fiction, and it doesn't understand what fiction or appreciate what fiction does.
I wanted to ask if among all the characters you wrote about, there is someone you feel more similar to.
I guess in thinking about that, I would say that the characters, the stories that are narrated in first person, I always feel closer, I think, to those characters, because I'm actually speaking from inside them. I'm speaking not in my voice, but in their voice. So in that cases, I feel like I am a little bit, instead of observing the character from the outside, I'm inhabiting them from the inside. So that always brings me closer to those characters. And I suppose some of the stories about younger characters that I wrote when I was younger, they certainly weren't autobiographical, but I was writing more closely, I think, to my own experience at the time. So stories like Jump or Dive, or excerpts from Swan Lake, or those sort of stories, I think I perhaps had a closer, more intimate relationship with the characters.
I would like to talk about places, because I have the feeling that they have a huge importance in your books. It's like your characters have some neuroses in big cities, like in New York, and when they go away, we have the feeling that it is an opportunity for them to have a reset that not always happens.
That's right. Mm-hmm. I feel like, I write not about myself because when I write, I like to be other people. And in the same way, when I write, I like to be in other places than I am. It seems to me sort of redundant to be in New York City and to be writing stories about characters in New York City. But sometimes I do that with Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You. That was one of the few times where I was living in New York City and I was writing a book about New York City. And I was writing it actually in the summer of 2003. So I was actually writing about the exact moment that James... And so that was sort of fun because it was about thinking very specifically about the time and place where I was. But I often like to write stories about places I haven't been or places I don't know very well, because then it's all about imagining, and I like to take those trips, travel with my imagination.
You do now live in Vermont, right?
I do, yes. And I feel like also what you were talking about, the rural versus the urban, I do feel like there's this idea that people in cities are neurotic, and then when they get to the countryside, suddenly everybody relaxes. But I don't think that's at all true. And I think, like in my novel, The Weekend, I really wanted to show how people can come from the city and go to the country and think they're going to have this very relaxed weekend. But they bring all their neuroses with them, and they're just as, you might pretend that you're more relaxed in the country, but you really are not.
And so I wanted to know something about the presence of animals, the innocence of animals in your stories, and in case if you have a guide animal yourself or an animal spirit you follow.
I've just always loved animals and been able to feel comfortable with animals in a way that I haven't felt as comfortable with human beings. I guess because there's something so pure about their spirits, and especially dogs, they're so accepting of people, and they love you so unconditionally. And I think also that I think our love for animals is a lot of projection. My dog, I think, loves me so much, but I know my dog would be very happy. She's very happy with anybody. As long as somebody's petting her, she's happy. But I feel like I have this very special connection with her. And I think I wanted to include animals in so many stories because my stories are so much about relationships between human beings. I feel like our relationships with animals give us something else in our lives that we don't get, between relationships with other people. And so that's why I think they keep popping up, to just add a different dimension to the stories in a way.
I have the feeling that sometimes in your stories you have a blurry finals, or we don't really know what's happening next.
Right.
I have that feeling that you care a lot about what readers put in your book.
Yes.
And so maybe you can tell us something
about.
Yeah, no,
that's why I'm very aware that the endings of my stories don't work for some people. Some people don't feel like the stories are explicit enough or conclude in a satisfying way. But I feel when I'm writing a story, I always try and stop when I get to that point where I feel like everything is in place and the conclusion can be interpreted in different ways, sort of that the reader can bring their experience to the story. And so I never try and tell people what I think the stories are about. I very much want the reader to interpret the story on their own and try to give them enough so that they can do that. And sometimes I think I fail, that I don't give people enough, and so they aren't able to form a conclusion about the story. But one of the writers I like so much, Ann Beattie, once said, she was talking about the endings, and I think ending short stories is particularly difficult because, they are so short, and so the ending has a lot more power than it does in a novel. But she was saying that often when she was writing stories that she would realize that she ended at the wrong point, and sometimes she would add just a few more sentences, or sometimes she would go back and look at, erase 3 sentences and find out that the real ending, she'd gone past it, she'd written too far. And so I always think about that, when I look at the end of my stories, have I gone too far? Have I not gone far enough? And to try and find that magic moment. Tell my students that too, because I think sometimes you don't trust yourself and you go a little too far because you want to try and make it clear, absolutely clear, when you don't need to. You can suggest something rather than state it.
Yeah, I would love you to say something about, if you have an idea why Italian readership is so fond of your stories.
It's really a mystery to me, and it's a wonderful mystery. I'm so pleased, to have found this audience here in Italy, which I don't have in the United States. In the United States, my work is not read as nearly as widely or appreciated the way it is in Italy. And so I think maybe it's something about my sensibility that, the way I see the world and the way I write about the world just resonates more with Italian readers, with an Italian sensibility than with Americans. And then I also think, I think a lot has to do with my translator, Josepina Anetto, that I think she renders my stories very beautifully and effectively in Italian. And so I don't think my stories would work in Italian unless they were, translated in such a fine way. So I feel very fortunate to have a translator who understands me and who understands my work and can recreate it in Italian.
I wanted to ask you something about the adaptation of your books into films.
I think, I've had 3 or 4 of my books made into films, and I've always started out very hopeful and thinking that this is going to be a good experience and that the film will capture the book. And I've realized that I don't think that will ever happen. And I think that's because I write so visually, and I think I write cinematically in a way. I'm always picturing in my head the scenes and what the people are wearing and what the weather is like. And I try and get that all on the page. And so, of course, when that's recreated for a movie, they make all these mistakes, but that's what I love. I'm so happy I'm a novelist and not a filmmaker, because when you're a novelist, you can be the costume designer, you can be the editor, you can be the sound person, you can, if you want it to rain, it rains very naturally. And in movies, I'm always that fake kind of rain where it's sunny out, but it's raining, and so I just love being totally creating and controlling my world in fiction, which you can't do, in a film. And so I've come to realize that if you agree to let somebody make a film of your book, you just have to give it to them, and that it's not like a translation. Mm-hmm. It's not somebody trying to recreate it in a different language. It's somebody really making something very different and personal to them, and they're using your idea, but it's theirs, and so you have to, stand back. And what's a little frustrating about that is, in our culture, movies have such a larger presence than books, especially in the United States, where, people don't read many books, but they do go to the movies a lot. And so I feel like that's what I worry about, that the movies displace then my book, because people think, I saw the movie, so I don't need to read the book. And that, because I feel like they're not equal, they're not the same thing. I worry about that, but there's nothing you can do about that.
What does a writer every day, all day long, when he does not write? I saw you in a video crafting and sewing a booklet by hand. It's
about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I realized that I had these sometimes very long periods in my life where I was not writing, and I like to write. I like when I'm being creative, and when I'm not, I get depressed and I feel like, why am I alive if I'm not being creative, if I'm not doing something? So that's when I decided to start a little press and to start making books myself. And just because it was something that I could be creative, I could make books, it had something to do with books, but it didn't involve writing them. It was about editing them and putting them together and designing them, which are all things that I enjoy. So I did that for a long time, and that's always been a good activity for me to do when I'm not writing.
Making books.
Making books, right, and working with other people's texts. But then, I also think I read, and reading for me, it's such a pleasure. But I also feel like by reading, it moves me towards that next book I'm going to write, because I feel like my books, as well as from my imagination, they come so much from what I've been reading. And I feel like what I read goes into my subconscious and it stays there for a while, and then it comes out. Hopefully it comes out as a new book for me. So that's why I always spend a lot of time reading in these periods as well.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Lorenza. It really was. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lucy.